Okay, this is the GFX100, the 100 megapixel medium format Fujifilm camera. I like to do a tips and tricks video as requested by many people to do that. While the camera will not be released for another 6 days, a lot of people will be receiving the camera at that point in time, and they have requested and would appreciate a tips and tricks video. So let's go into your setup menu. First press your menu and go over to your wrench icon, and then we're first going to button and dial settings and go over, and by turning your front command dial, you can actually scroll through the pages. Here's page 1 and page 2. Let's first go down to touch screen settings, where you actually have multiple options here for setting things. One of the really important things is for the touch to swipe functionality. You actually have 4 of those, including the function buttons on the camera for touch swipe functions, where you can actually program it for a certain function for swiping left, right, bottom, and top. This is default off, so you'll need to go into this menu and turn this on. Okay, secondly, since we're already in the area, we're going to turn on touch screen settings. And by the way, the touch to autofocus, and I'm a left eye dominant, I actually use the lower left quadrant of the screen, but you can actually set that for whatever you prefer. So I actually use my thumb on the touch screen with my eye in the viewfinder for setting the autofocus point selection. It is very, very snappy. And I have mine set for the lower left quadrant. The default is the entire screen is set. Whatever is highlighted blue is where touch for autofocus point selection is enabled. Since I'm left eye dominant, when I actually have my eye up to the viewfinder, depending on which viewfinder I'm using, right now I'm using the tilt adapter with the viewfinder, my nose would actually touch up here, so I would not want the entire screen, because the camera of course cannot differentiate between one of your fingers and your noses. I'm going to choose what I prefer, which is lower left quadrant, but you choose whichever you need to set. Okay, now let's go into something that I particularly like, exposure compensation button settings, which is right above the touch screen settings. And default is on when pressing, so when you're actually pressing the exposure compensation button, you can actually turn the dial. I think I have mine. Well, I'm actually not in that screen right now. Excuse me, I have to get out of the menu screen. Sorry about that. I have mine set for on-off switch, which means all you have to do is press the exposure compensation button once, and it is always on, so I can actually turn the rear command dial for setting my exposure compensation. But the default is that you have to hold down the exposure compensation button and then turn your dial, and of course you'll actually see the exposure compensation over here on the primary screen on left on the sub-menu display, or what I actually like to call the top display of the GFX100. We don't need to call that a sub-menu display, do we? Can't we just call it the top display? So now let's go over to screen setup. There's actually a lot of really important stuff in screen setup, and we're going to scroll over to, by the way, I always love to change my focus scale units. I assume a lot of people in Europe will want to keep it at meters. I choose it for feet for obvious reasons. And let's go over here. And what Fujifilm calls the SubMonitor setting is the top display, and what Fujifilm is referring to as the rear SubMonitor, of course, is this tiny rear display down here. Let's first go up to SubMonitor settings. We actually have a lot of customization here available. We actually have a still mode and a movie mode customization available, where you can actually set all the parameters and information for everything that you see here. But I want to get out of that and go over to the primary one that most people are going to be using most of the time, which is in still mode. And of course we actually have dials as the default, but you can get out of that actually by pressing this button. It will actually scroll you through the primary screen, or the information display as Fujifilm calls it, and the dials display, and the histogram. I prefer always to keep it on information, but you do as you see fit. You go over to information, and you can set all these parameters as you see fit. This is actually how I have mine set. Shutter speed, shooting mode, photometry. Photometry is what we call metering, as far as Canon and Nikon goes. Boost mode, shutter type. Of course, down here we have shots remaining, and of course our battery for our left and right. Okay, let's get out of that, and let's go over to rear SubMonitor Settings. There's a lot of customization here also. You also have parameters for setting both still and movie mode parameters for the rear sub display, or what we call the back bottom display. Let's keep it simple. Still mode. You actually have two different types of information display. One that lets you set 6 parameters, which is what I have set right now. You can see I have 2, 2, and 2, 6. Or you actually have here 8 that you can set with smaller little boxes. I choose information display number 1, but you could also go down here for a scale, such as exposure compensation. Also, too, a histogram, or you can completely turn it off. I don't know who would want it off. Maybe it would irritate some people, but you have the option for turning it off for information number 1. You can set the parameters of whatever you see fit. This is where I have mine set: aperture, frames remaining, ISO, exposure compensation, flash settings, like front curtain, rear curtain, so on and so forth. And I actually like to have my battery levels also displayed on the back of the camera. Okay, so that's the rear sub-monitor display settings customization. Okay, a really important one. Let's go over here to our shooting settings, and it's on page 2. There we go. Shutter type. Okay, we're in shooting menu, page 2, shutter type. And here we have mechanical shutter. Like, if you're going to do, this is actually very important, electronic front curtain plus electronic, or what Fujifilm calls EF plus E plus E front curtain. Mechanical shutter should be obvious. You actually have 2 shutter curtains in this camera, the same as you do on basically each and every other camera you've ever used, Nikon, Canon, or any other Fujifilm camera. Electronic shutter should be obvious. You cannot do flash photography with electronic shutter. It's actually a digital scan of the shutter. Electronic front curtain shutter works up until 1/1250th of a second. Mechanical shutter works faster than 1/2050th of a second, which is Fujifilm, and their little sub-display here shows you as shortest for suitable or best for shortest blackout time and fastest shutter speed. Mechanical plus electronic shutter is where you're actually wide open, and of course you can't do flash photography with electronic shutter, but once your shutter, depending on whether you're shooting aperture priority or shutter priority, if you're up above 1/4000th of a second for necessity, it will automatically switch over from mechanical shutter to electronic, where I keep it most of the time, unless it's flash photography, because there are artifacts with electronic front curtain. Electronic front curtain, it means that the first curtain does not drop or fall at all. This greatly eliminates shake. You're like, well, I don't need to have that much of a shake, especially on this camera. The actual IBIS stabilization combined with the lens stabilization, which specifically with this lens, the 100-200, or another OIS lens like the 250mm or the 120, is really quite incredible. Yes, but if you're going to do some handheld shots, below or even at 1/10 of a second, for example, this greatly helps, because instead of 2 curtains falling, which you would have on a mechanical shutter, where you might incur some shock and some blurriness of the image, say you want to do a handheld shot indoors at 1/10 of a second, just for whatever reason that you choose that you need to do that, and the shots might come out. Since stabilization on this camera is absolutely extraordinary, you want to give yourself every edge possible. There's no first curtain that's actually falling an electronic front curtain, which works up to 1/2050th of a second. Mechanical shutter works when it's faster than 1/2050th of a second, and of course electronic works after that. If you're going to do specifically flash photography, I would not want to choose any electronic front curtain, because there are bokeh artifacts and artifacts that are introduced with the use of electronic shutter. All electronic front curtain shutter is like I said, is that the first curtain does not fall or drop at all. It is actually a digital scan of the sensor, and then the secondary curtain, the actual physical curtain, falls. So you have half as many shutter curtains falling, and even though the IBIS stabilization on this camera is extraordinary, also in conjunction, if you're using an OIS, is even more so extraordinary. If you're going to use this camera for its amazing capabilities as the world's first medium format camera for low light ambient photography, it is at crazy slow shutter speeds. Like I said, you want to give yourself every advantage. So if it's going to be ambient photography, extremely slow shutter speeds, And of course, you're going to be using your IBIS, hopefully so, in a continuous mode. If you're going to be shooting at, say, 1/30th of a second or slower, you want to use electronic front curtain shutter, or EFC, or what Fujifilm calls specifically EF, electronic front curtain. I hope I made that abundantly clear. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm going to post another tips and tricks videos, but these are some of the primary ones, and I've actually spelled out in my book. By the way, there's a link below, and the book is free, and I'm updating it now for the second edition for the Gfx100, a free Fujifilm tricks and tips book that will give you information and help you out a lot for using your Fujifilm camera, including this one that I will have updated for the second edition to include the Gfx100 medium format 100 megapixel camera. And thank you so much for watching. If you like these videos, you can click the link below, and also the link to my free book is below. No strings attached, completely free, and thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.